Hi friends, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney and a guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. Here's what we're discussing today. In case you've been in a remote location without either Wi-Fi or a good radio signal, Alec Baldwin has once again been indicted by a grand jury in the death of the cinematographer Halyna Hutchins. We have the indictment here. This is the indictment from the grand jury from the 1st Judicial District, County of Santa Fe, State of New Mexico, versus Alexander Ray Baldwin. And it is case number 13 in 2024 in that 1st Judicial Circuit, 13th criminal case. I don't know if you're trixidicsophobic or not, but 13 might not be the best omen if you're Alex Baldwin. This is the grand jury indictment. And the first cause of action here is involuntary manslaughter, negligent use of a firearm. And essentially the allegation is that he did cause the death of Halyna Hutchins in the commission of negligent use of a firearm, an unlawful act which did not amount to a felony, a fourth-degree felony contrary to NMSA 1978, Section 30-2-3B, 1994 edition. And then they plead in the alternative, Count 1, involuntary manslaughter without due caution or circumspection. Now, what that means is simply this. This is simply another way of saying that it's negligent homicide by an act committed with the total disregard or indifference for the safety of others, an act that was such that an ordinary person would anticipate that death might occur under the circumstances, a fourth-degree felony. So then they name the witnesses, and that's really all there is to the indictment. Now, the document on file with the state court includes two allegations in essentially alternative pleading. The count is for involuntary manslaughter, which is homicide without the intention to commit homicide. In other words, it's an unintentional homicide. So having read the indictment, we now can see that there are two routes that a jury could take to convict Alec Baldwin in this case. One of those is the negligent use of a firearm, which I truly believe is probably the most important one. Why do I say that? Well, because the defense that Alec put up early in this mess was that he never pulled the trigger. Since I was 18 years old and in the Army, where I first had the opportunity to fire a gun, I have had a pretty good understanding of how firearms work. Under normal circumstances, where people are not testing them or doing something untoward to them, in order for a round to leave the chamber without someone hammering on the hammer of the firearm, and in order for the bullet to strike someone or something, two things have to happen. Someone has to press the trigger, and the firing pin has to strike the primer, or in this case, if it's a revolver, the hammer has to strike the primer. Now, this is true whether you're shooting an M16, an AR-15, a semi-automatic pistol, or even a black powder pistol. Those things have to happen. There has to be a trigger press. Now, does that mean that firearms never go off by themselves? No. As we'll see when we look at the FBI report, Baldwin's gun could be made to discharge without a trigger pull, but that was due to the failure of the internal mechanics of the gun caused by the testing done by the FBI. As we will see, when the FBI received it, it would not fire without a trigger pull. Now, at the time of the shooting, every reputable gun person on YouTube was saying pretty much the same thing. The trigger had to have been pulled, and that's because we all understand how firearms work. Now, some firearms, like the early models of the Sig Sauer P320, could experience a sudden, unintended discharge when they were dropped. Most modern revolvers, however, don't suffer this fault because they have hammer bar safeties that keep the hammer away from the cartridge in the chamber. Now, Baldwin consistently maintained he did not pull the trigger, and every time he said that, every shooter I know cringed, because no shooter pulls the trigger. They press the trigger. But that was Baldwin's statement. He never pulled the trigger. After the first indictment, the defense, led by lawyers from Quinn Emanuel, It's a big name law firm, white shoe law firm. They put up a spirited procedural defense. They claimed that the special prosecutor was holding two government offices and had to be removed, and I think at some point the court was likely to agree with them. And as a result, the questions about how the firearm operated were such that the case was dismissed, and then the firearm was sent on to the FBI lab for testing. Now, the FBI conducted that testing. Let's take a look at the FBI's testing report. Now, the FBI lab, located either in Quantico, Virginia or Huntsville, Alabama, it's difficult to tell which, did a number of tests on the firearms. The first of those was explosives chemistry, where they looked at the ammunition. And the second of those was firearms/tool marks, and this is where the interesting information is. As we go on down here, we can see that the firearm is a .45 Colt or .45 long Colt caliber F11I Pieta single action revolver model 1873, SA Californian, which functioned normally when tested in the laboratory. It contained quarter and half-cocked manual safeties, which are intended to prevent slippage of the hammer during cocking and the release of the hammer by a normal pull of the trigger. Additionally, item 2 has a hammer with a fixed firing pin and does not contain any internal safety mechanisms to prevent the firing pin from striking the primer of a chambered cartridge, such as a transfer bar or a hammer block. This is consistent with normal operation for a single action revolver of this design. So that's really the key takeaway from this report. Now let's talk a little bit more about the firearm. Most revolvers today are double action, which means that you can pull the trigger and it not only fires it, but it cocks it first. So it cocks it first and then it fires the firearm. That's how double action pistols work. A double action firearm takes a lot more trigger finger strength to shoot than does a single action firearm. A single action revolver requires someone to cock it before it will fire. And because people have sweaty hands and are not always careful, there are two safeties built into this particular firearm: the quarter cock safety and the half cock safety. If you pull the hammer back to 1/4 of its travel, it will require a trigger press to release the hammer. But even if that happens, you will not have enough force to detonate the primer because it's only 1/4 of the way back. In the half cock position, half of the travel, when the trigger was pressed, the cylinder was out of alignment with the barrel, and as a result, the gun would not fire. So, when fully cocked, the only way it could be discharged was with a manual trigger press. Now, the defense is making big noises about the quote-unquote destructive testing done by the FBI. But give the feds a little slack here. First, it's worth noting that as received, it would not fire without a trigger pull, and the destructive testing wasn't done intentionally to destroy the weapon. When the FBI hammered on the hammer to discharge a cartridge, because that was the normal testing methodology, it actually destroyed the inner workings of the gun. Once repaired to the same state that it was in before that test, it worked according to specs. Now, we've gone over the technical aspects. Let's discuss the two ways that they can get a conviction. There are two types of negligence at issue here: criminal negligence and ordinary negligence. Ordinary negligence is much the same as what a plaintiff would have to prove for a tort lawsuit. The defendant had a duty of care to act as a reasonable person. He breached that duty of care, and as a result of that breach, someone was injured. In this case, they were killed. To prove a case under the negligent use of firearm statute, all the state has to prove is ordinary negligence. And here, from the New Mexico law, is the issues with regard to the negligent use of a weapon. A conviction of involuntary manslaughter by negligent use of a weapon requires the government to prove negligence which is ordinary. Negligence is usually defined to be the omission to do something which a reasonable man, guided by considerations which ordinarily regulate the conduct of human affairs, would do, or doing something which a prudent and reasonable man would never do. And in this case, I think we have that in spades. So to prove the case under the negligent use of a firearm statute, all the state has to prove is this ordinary negligence. And that's not going to be hard to do. Well, why is that? Because Baldwin was frequently quoted as calling himself an expert on guns and gun issues. He was a big advocate for gun control, claimed to be an expert in that area. An individual who is an expert in the area of firearms would certainly know the 4 rules of gun safety. And here they are. The first and most important rule is to treat all guns as if they are always loaded. Now, when I retire a firearm to my safe for any reason, I pull the magazines out and I make sure that the chamber is empty and I put them away safely. And I do that because even though we always treat all guns as if they are loaded, they're much safer when they are not loaded. So, obviously it makes sense to treat something that can destroy a human life as if it can destroy a human life at any second. So that brings us to the second rule. Never let the muzzle point at anything that you are not willing to destroy, like, for example, your cinematographer. Keep your finger off the trigger until your sights are on the target and you have made the decision to shoot. One of the things that really irritates those of us in the firearms community is when somebody is shown in a movie with their finger through the trigger guard touching the trigger. No actual person who uses firearms handles a firearm in that way. Rather, we keep our finger indexed along the slides so that we don't put our finger in there where if we were to fall or do something else, we might accidentally discharge the firearm. And then the fourth rule is be sure of your target and always know what is behind it. Every person who handles a gun must receive instruction on these rules before they ever touch a firearm. In certain classes where I've taught the legal part of the course, we've had people who brought in their dad's gun or their grandmother's gun and had no idea whether it was even loaded. That's negligence in and of itself. Because of the rules, if we treat every gun as if it's loaded, one of the things that we do is we make sure that it isn't loaded if at all possible. In addition to these well-known safety rules, we have some common sense rules that we use at the range. If we hand a person a gun at the range, we have a protocol. We drop the magazine, open the slide on a semi-automatic, and check for the presence of a cartridge in the chamber. We look, then we look away, then we look again. Then we stick our finger into the bore to make sure that we can assure ourselves that there is nothing in that chamber. With a revolver, we have the cylinder open and the gun unloaded, and we hand the gun over that way. This ensures that whoever gets that firearm gets one that is clearly empty, and it's up to them to load and use it as they see fit. Had this simple step been done, in other words, opened up the chamber and let him see, nothing bad could have happened because the round would have been detected and removed. More importantly, he could have spun the cylinder and checked to see if there were any rounds in there. And even a blank round can cause grievous bodily harm. There is an actor who played in the series, I believe it was Airwolf, who wound up shooting himself in the head with a blank gun, and it killed him because the concussive force killed him. So, at the end of the day, the person holding the gun has to follow all of the safety rules. None of them are optional, and they are personally responsible for the safety of the firearm and those around them. Full stop. Once that gun is in your hand, only you control where it's pointed. Only you have the authority and the ability to check it for a load. Only you are responsible for keeping your finger off the trigger and pointed in a safe direction, and no, there's no "we were getting ready to shoot this film" exception to these rules. In the final analysis, it was Baldwin, and only Baldwin, who was responsible for the gun being loaded and going off. No matter what he believes, he pulled the trigger. Now, the second route the state can take is criminal negligence, which is an enhanced level of negligence generally. The phrase "without due caution and circumspection" has been held to involve the concept of criminal negligence, which concept includes conduct which is reckless, willful, and wanton. In this situation, it is reckless. Not checking the chamber when handed the firearm was reckless. Not keeping the gun pointed in a safe direction was reckless. Full stop. Baldwin likely knew that cast members and stage hands were shooting the guns out at the site when they were being filmed, as it was being filmed. They had crew members and cast people doing that. The idea that this was a prop gun and was thus safe just doesn't square with what he knew. The armorer is also charged with crimes in this case. In fact, she's charged with the same crimes and in the alternative just as Baldwin is. She's charged with either ordinary negligence or criminal negligence. But here, where the state has badly overplayed its hand and where, if justice prevails, she will have the case dismissed against her. Let's take a look at a motion filed recently by Reed. Now, this was filed by the lawyers who are representing her on this homicide issue, and they are requesting jury instructions on causation. Now, you may wonder why that is. The special prosecutors have previously stated they had information that there was an alleged modification of the gun used by Baldwin on the Rust set. The prosecutors indicated that they believed this impacted causation of the manslaughter as to Baldwin, but not as to Gutierrez-Reed. This was based on the dismissal of charges against Baldwin without prejudice, and we have now received the prosecutor's gun report and from experts Lucian Haig and Mike Haig. The Haig report does not indicate any modification to the gun, and the FBI report didn't indicate any modification to the gun either. So, evidence at trial will show that Gutierrez-Reed had asked calls to be called back into the church if the gun was going to be used at all. But here's the key of this. Baldwin pointing the gun at Ms. Hutchins and pulling the trigger are independent, intervening causes. In an uninterrupted sequence of events, Hannah would have been called into the church to perform her job as the armorer on the film. Hannah had no knowledge the gun would be used in a church scene, let alone be pointed at a person. The Haig report specifies that the trigger had to be pulled and rules out certain types of accidental discharge. So I will have to do a separate recording at some point on the issue of efficient intervening causes, but the bottom line is this. If you have something like a fire and the fire is burning the grassland and you have a house sitting over here and Joe Blow over here started the fire and it's burning the grassland, but all of a sudden an airplane crashes and hits the house, that is an intervening cause, and the people who started the fire are not responsible. It's a terrible analogy, but you get the idea. The idea is that where there is something that stops the causation, then it's not fair to hold somebody accountable for something that didn't actually cause the harm. And as I said, only Alec Baldwin had the ability to point that gun at Halyna Hutchins, and only he pressed the trigger. So from my point of view, I believe a jury instruction on intervening causation here would be a clear winner for Ms. Gutierrez-Reed. So that's what I have for you today. Hopefully you found this interesting, enlightening maybe a little bit. If you have the opportunity today, I have a charity you might consider wanting to donate to. It's called No Kid Hungry, and you can take a look at it here. I think it's really important in a land of plenty that we try very hard to make sure that children do not go hungry. And this is a charity that is recommended and thought of reasonably highly by people that I like, and so I offer it to you just as a suggestion. I've obviously not been contacted by that charity, and I don't have any relationship with them. But anyway, thank you so much for being here, for taking part, and catch me down here at the beach again next time. If you like this video, here are a few others you might try, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a terrific day, guys.